Welcome to the Quote and Roll podcast. I am your host, Kwok Hui Lan. Today's guest is Professor Anthony Reddie, Professor of Black Theology at the University of Oxford. In this episode, we will talk about the development of Black theology in the United Kingdom, as well as his forthcoming book, Living Black Theology. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
I know that you have a forthcoming book that is coming out in August 2025. The title is Living Black Theology. What are the major themes and why did you write the book?
So the major themes in the book is really using Black theology as a way to examine issues of colonialism and neocolonialism as they impact in the way in which we have done theology, certainly in the United Kingdom, and the way in which churches and Christian mission has been embedded really with the notions of whiteness and coloniality and white supremacy. And I guess using the term living Black theology for me really was trying to do two things. One was to recognize, I guess, not just how colonialism has impacted on the way in which we think about theology, and we think about the development of Christian mission and how empire and Christianity have been very much linked together, obviously going right back to the era of Emperor Constantine. But it's also the fact that as someone who has come from a colonial background, my parents were part of the British Empire. They came from the Caribbean island of Jamaica and came to Britain in the 1950s. And I'm the eldest of four children. So I was born in 1964 and brought up within the Methodist tradition. And oftentimes when we talk about decolonizing theology, we think of it as purely an intellectual exercise in terms of we look at texts and we look at methods and we look at sources and norms, and we look at how theology is developed over a period of time, certainly over centuries. But what we tend to overlook is the way in which that sense of coloniality has also been internalized within people's minds and within their thinking and the constructs that they have that shape their theological imagination. And so what I'm also then thinking about in the book is how we don't just deconstruct texts and history and sources, but we also deconstruct ourselves. And so one of my heroes, my all-time hero, is James H. Cone, who's often seen as the founding patriarch of Black liberation theology. And Cone was known to say on many occasions that God does not do theology. Theology is human speech about God, which therefore means if it's human speech about God, if it's something that human beings do in a very constructive way, then it behoves us then to be honest about our social location and the influences that inform our thinking and our imagination as we try to talk about God in hopefully in ways that are reflexive and reflective of what it means to be a human being.
As you know, Dr. Cone developed his Black theology in the history of slavery and also the civil rights movement. Can you share with the audience who may not be very knowledgeable about racism in the UK? What is the context of doing Black theology in your country?
So in terms of doing Black theology in the UK, I guess the most foundational aspect of it is to reflect on the nature of the British Empire. As many people may know, the British Empire is the largest empire the world has ever seen. And at its peak, about a quarter of the world is controlled by an island that is only 44,000 square miles in circumference. So essentially, for many of your viewers in America, it's just worth reminding us that something like Texas, for example, is bigger than the UK. And yet, if you go as far east as the Pacific Islands and Australia, New Zealand, and the various islands that were owned by the British in terms of Polynesia and Micronesia and those areas. And they go across and you take in Hong Kong and Singapore, and then you go further west, and then you get India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and then you get further west again. And so by the time you get into the Americas, you have Canada, and then you got the Caribbean islands. And so to understand racism in Britain, I often say to students, you have to understand two things. First, you have to understand the empire and the white settler communities that settled in various parts of the world, always creating hierarchies in which whiteness was at the top and blackness and various other forms of ethnicities and cultures somewhere between the top and the bottom. And how Christianity as a religion of empire helped to enshrine those kind of doctrines and notions of manifest destiny as experienced by white British people. What then happens is that post-World War II, and many scholars have written about this, including myself, we then say that the empire that is without then comes home. So the empire comes back to the mother country. So although Britain wins the war, although more accurately it's Americans and the Russians who win the war, but Britain is on the winning side, there's a huge labour shortage. And so what Britain then does is it sends out to the colonies in order to encourage the children of empire to come back to the mother country in order to work and to become cheap labour to help rebuild the British economy in the years after World War II. So they send out to the Caribbean, and between 1948 and approximately 1965, somewhere in the region of 2.5 million people from the Caribbean, including my parents, they come to Britain as British subjects. So when my parents came from the island of Jamaica, the island had been colonized by the British and largely run by the British, but sometimes Spanish and the French, from 1694 all the way through to 1962. So Jamaica did not become independent until August 1962. So when my parents came in 1957 and 1959 respectively, they were still British subjects. They still had a British passport as their country of birth was not independent yet. And so what happened is that all the migrants came from the Caribbean first, then from the Indian subcontinent, so largely India, Pakistan, and then later Bangladesh. And then into the 70s, people then came from the continent of Africa, mainly West Africa, initially Nigeria and Ghana. And then later in the 80s and 90s, places like Zimbabwe, but also Kenya and Tanzania, and all the various places that Britain owned. Now, the key thing is that these people from the global majority world were invited as children of empire to come and work. But having invited them, when they came into a country that defines itself, still does, in terms of whiteness and white being considered to be normal, these people, such as my parents, faced hostility and racism, including in the church as well. And so there's a long history of writers such as Mukti Barton. So Mukti Barton is one of our leading Asian feminist theologians, and she's an Anglican, and she was born and brought up in India, in the Punjab. And so she and many others, and including myself, have begun to do our Black theology as a way of reflecting on what does it mean to come from an immigrant experience. As I said, I'm a first generation British-born person of Caribbean roots. To be in the mother country, to be children of empire, to be missionized through the missionary agencies that were sent out from Britain in the 18th and 19th century, to be made Christians, to be told that you belong to the nation through citizenship, but also to be part of the body of Christ, and then find that, of course, that is hypocrisy, because the nation doesn't want you and still doesn't see you as authentically belonging to the country. But also there's racism in the body of Christ, and therefore even the egalitarian teachings of Jesus have been warped and distorted, and you are never treated as equals. So Black theology in Britain is much younger than it is in the US. It really begins to take off in the early 1990s. The first self-authored book is by Robert Beckford, who is a Pentecostal writer. And in 1998, he writes a book called Jesus is Dread. And in the book, what he's doing is using the lens and frameworks of Rastafarianism, which is a religious movement that started in Jamaica, which is the largest English-speaking island in the Caribbean, where his parents are from, and that's where my parents are from. And that's where the greater majority of Caribbean migrants are from, although there are other smaller islands in the Caribbean. And he uses Rastafari as a way of rethinking and critiquing mission Christianity. So he gets his PhD in 98. I think I got my PhD in 2000, and where the kind of sort of two leading Black theologians, amongst some others as well, who are writing really against the backdrop of empire and critiquing the internalization of racism within the body politic of Britain, having noticed that this racism was first obviously practiced on the mission field amongst the subalterns and natives of the British Empire.
That is why Black theology in Britain has close connections with postcolonial theology, which you have also written about. Can you say something about the connection?
So certainly within the British context, we can't talk about liberation theology as a singular movement. I think it's always been linked to a post-colonial optics, and to think about how the Christian faith and empire have always gone together. In one of my later books, I look at the connection between Jesus and Pontius Pilate as depicted in John's Gospel. And one of the things I do when I look at that encounter is I say to my British readers that one of the conceits that we have to deal with when we think about this particular encounter in the sacred texts of Scripture is the way in which the British establishment, particularly the Church of England, as the Church of English nationalism, this is the Church of England that for many years, certainly in the 17th and 18th and early part of the 19th century, actually sort of still had a monopoly upon religious practice. And so those who belonged to smaller churches like Methodist and Baptist and Presbyterian and Congregation, forms of ecclesiology, they were deemed illegal, and you were not allowed to worship in those other traditions. Everyone had to be an Anglican. So the Church of England is very much at the heart of this colonial enterprise that brings Christianity and imperialism and colonialism together. And when we look at this encounter between Jesus and Pontius Pilate, what I point out is that most white British Christians, and particularly those who have links to the Church of England, they imagine themselves to be Jesus or to be the heirs of the Jesus movement. But actually, they have more in common with Pontius Pilate, who was a colonial apparatchik. He was someone who was sent by Caesar to this particular region in Galilee and Judea in order to put down the Caesar rebellion amongst this Jewish group who often refused to acknowledge the writ of Rome. And so when we think about English Christianity, particularly white English or more broadly British Christianity, we still imagine ourselves as the church to be identifying with Jesus, but actually we have much more in common with Pontius Pilate, who was, as I said, who was a colonial official. And Britain had many versions of Pontius Pilate who were sent to India and were sent to Australia, sent to Canada, sent to Southern Africa, sent to the Caribbean. And they would have been there to insist on the power of London and empire and to have their authority endorsed by the Christian church. And so therefore, when Black theology was being developed in Britain in the 1990s and has been in development ever since, there's two key things to this development, which is very different to the African-American experience. First is that empire and Christianity are so linked together that we can't just do liberation theology without also thinking about a post-colonial framework in that work, which then does two things. I think internally, when we talk about what it is to be Black, in the British context, we've always used that in a political sense. And so a form of political blackness is not necessarily just about skin color or about origins. Yes, undoubtedly, it has a strong African perspective to it. And yet at the same time, people like Mukti Barton, people like Michael Jagassar, and people like Inderjit Bogle, and all of whom are of Asian descent, all of them have links with the continent of India, either born in India or their parents or grandparents are Indian, that they would be considered to be part of the Black theology movement, and they would see themselves as being Black, as well as myself. So essentially, Black in Britain, as in the Black in Black theology, is very much about an anti-imperial framework, because what we saw in terms of empire is there's no evidence that Britain treated one part of the empire better than the other part of the empire. If you were in India and you were in Madras, for example, or you're in Trinidad in Port of Spain, or you're in Lagos in Nigeria, the way in which the British Empire controls you and the way in which whiteness then becomes the de facto norm that displaces people in their own countries is one that becomes a unifier. So when Black theology was developing, there were many Asian people who were part of the movement alongside people of African and Caribbean descent. And so that post-colonial framework for Black theology is one that creates a kind of political unity of all people who are essentially the children of empire, who are using the liberationist frameworks of Christian theology, but also informed by post-colonial perspectives. So the work of someone like R.S. Sugatharaja, for example, is very important to the development of Black theology in Britain, because he's one of the first people who then challenges us not to see the biblical text as entirely a liberative operation and to recognize how colonialism itself is embedded within the text. And even someone like Jesus, not necessarily Jesus of history, but the Jesus who was proclaimed through the centuries as a Christ of faith, is invariably a colonial model that's been used against so-called subaltern people. I guess the other key thing then about the engagement with post-colonialism alongside liberationist ideas, I often see them as being different sides of the same coin. So they're connected, but they're not the same things. But the reason why I think the post-colonial element is also important is that although the British Empire is undoubtedly a Christian empire, the people it imprisons, the people it controls, the people it oppresses and marginalizes across the empire, that they're not always Christian themselves. And so one of the things that we often also do within Black theology is to acknowledge the interfaith, and sometimes more recently, we talk about multiple religious belonging in terms of that ambivalence around what does it mean when one's ancestors were not always Christians, but they belonged to various forms of indigenous religions that were always castigated and attacked by the British Empire because of its insistence upon a kind of white evangelical Christianity. And so Black theology in Britain, although it is overwhelmingly Christian, is not exclusively Christian. And so some of the work that has been done by scholars like Michael Jagassar and a good friend of mine called Raj Patel are ones that are looking at the relationship between Christian theology and Hinduism or Islam, or in terms of African religions, to say that we can't just see this as a pure Christian project or Christian product because of the problematic way in which empire and white Christianity was used to suppress other ideas and other thought forms and other epistemologies.
That is why I have appreciated so much of your work, as well as the work of Sugatharaja and Jessa, because I was born in the former colony of Hong Kong and have been also doing postcolonial theology. Now, Anthony, you are the first professor of Black theology at Oxford. Can you share with us how is Black theology received in academia in the UK?
I think it's fair to say that there's two realities for Black theology in Britain. There is the existence of it before the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, and then afterwards. So I would say before 2020 that Black theology was very much what we sometimes call in England a cottage industry. That basically just means that going back to the days before industrialization and mass production, people would make goods and services in people's homes, in small cottages, and it would be a very small domestic affair. And so Black theology was like that. It was a very small community. Myself, Robert Beckford, maybe a dozen people. Actually, not many women writing. It was mainly men. So womanist theology in Britain is a very small movement. It's beginning to take off now, but it's been small. And Black theology was largely ignored. So there were no universities that taught it. There was certainly no Black academics working in universities. Some were working in theological colleges or seminaries. And for the most part, it was largely ignored. And there was no evidence of any Black theology ever taking place in Oxford University. I was appointed in January 2020. And then in May, as we know, George Floyd is murdered. And then alongside that, we have the pandemic as well. But the resurgence of Black Lives Matter in the wake of George Floyd's murder did something to the body politic within the UK, which has been quite interesting. And so Oxford suddenly became aware of systemic racism in ways that it had not previously. And then because of that, we suddenly found there was an appetite for people to want to talk about race, to want to talk about empire and colonialism and the impact of colonialism on Christian theology and churches and mission and ecclesiology. And that then has given rise to this, I guess, that sudden emergence of Black theology in Oxford. As I said, I started in January 2020. In September 2023, I was made the first professor of Black theology in the almost 900-year history of theology in Oxford. That theology is the oldest discipline in the university because the colleges that make up the university, it's 43 colleges, that nearly all of them are religious foundations. And the first work that was done in Oxford back in the end of the 11th century was very much really from the roots of English monasticism. So you got a discipline that is almost 900 years old, and the first professor is appointed just over 2 years ago. First professor in Black theology, that's me. Oxford is still a very traditional place. And so for the most part, the students who come both at undergraduate and postgraduate level are largely doing white Euro-American theology. As I said, I'm not only the first Black professor, I was the first Black faculty member to be a person of colour, the first Black person to teach theology in Oxford. And so what I have tried to do is to help bring into conversation and into the curricula things that have been existing, let's say, in America, like for the best part of 40, 50 years now. So 2022, I was able to develop the first course in Black theology. To put it into context, we have a third-year elective module called Special Theologians, which is where rather than studying a genre or a particular methodology of theology, you can study a person. And the existing options that existed were all men, so there's still no woman theologian. So I'm afraid to say that we should be studying you as Quapulan, but there are no women who exist at all in these options. And the men, it starts with Oregon and ends with Maltman. And so when I came, I queried this and questioned it and challenged it. And then post George Floyd, it was agreed that I could create a class on James Cone. And so you could study the work and the canon of James Cone. And that's the first Black theology course that has ever existed in the history of Oxford University. So, so there's still a long way to go. There's still not much work that gets done on Black and womanist theologies. A little bit more on postcolonial, but not a huge amount either. It's still, for the most part, a very white and Eurocentric curricula.
Indeed, there is so much work to do. And that is why you are also the director of the Center of Black Theology at Regent's Park College. What are the programs or projects that this center does?
So as a center, we don't teach any classes, and that's just due to the structure of Oxford University. So the individual colleges don't teach the different courses. That's what is done by the faculty, so that your viewers have a sense of how Oxford and Cambridge work. So Oxford and Cambridge are made up of individual colleges. I think it's 31 colleges in Cambridge, 43 in Oxford. And I work in Regent's Park College, which is a Baptist college. It's the only Baptist college in either Oxford or Cambridge. And all the teaching takes place in the college, but the curricula itself and the overall syllabus, that is controlled by the individual departments. And these departments exist within the centralized university. So it's a partnership between the university that centralizes these different departments and then invites the individual colleges to do the seminars and the lectures of students who are taking a particular study. So my center doesn't teach any classes. I teach classes as an individual, but the center is really a research center. And so largely what we do is a mixture of consultancy work. So we've done some work for the Council for World Mission. And the Council for World Mission is a largely congregational and Presbyterian body of churches. It has its roots in the London Missionary Society, and they became the Council for World Mission in 1977. And they're a partnership of 34 member churches, as I said, largely congregational and Presbyterian. And they exist mainly in the Pacific, in New Zealand. They have a member church. I think the Presbyterian Church in Hong Kong is one of the member churches. And there are various other churches in the Caribbean and in Africa. And so we did a project for them that was called Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission, which had a number of scholars looking at the relationship between colonialism and empire and whiteness, particularly as it impacts on Christian mission, and then deconstructing all of that using both postcolonial and decolonial work. So we did that as a project. And then as a follow-up project, in partnership with the Church of England, I co-edited a book earlier this year entitled Towards a Critical White Theology. And that book really was an invitation to, I guess, primarily the Church of England initially, but also the other churches within the UK around how we replace an existing white theology that never acknowledges that it's white with a kind of critical white theology that is much more reflexive and much more contextually nuanced in the way in which, so for example, I've read your work for many years, and you are very clear about your point of departure. You're clear about your Asian heritage, growing up in Hong Kong. You are transparent about how your context and your history shapes your theology. In the same way that the Black theologians in America will talk about slavery and talk about their experience, and then more latterly Black power as a way of doing theology. In the British context, we will talk about colonialism and talk about the existence of empire and anti-Black racism or Afrophobia as ways of shaping our Black theology. And yet, as we both know, when most white theologians write their work, they don't say anything about their context. They don't say anything about their being white. They don't say anything about their privilege. And so what we're saying in this book is to encourage white theologians to be self-reflective about their whiteness and how that has shaped the work that they do. And so that book came out earlier this year. And then, of course, is my current book, Living Black Theology. So what we're doing in the center is really developing projects that will give rise to different texts and to create resources in partnership with other agencies that will help to bring about a greater, I guess, a sort of decolonial awareness, really, of how theology as a subject and Christian practice and mission and ministry needs to be rethought and deconstructed. Our current work at the moment is a larger project around decolonizing theological education in Britain. It's ecumenical, but it's very much dominated by the Church of England. And again, as I said, there's very little self-awareness of the coloniality that is embedded within theological education in Britain. So we're working in partnership with the Church of England and with some other bodies and partners around using Black theology as a lens to think about some of these critical issues that have not been discussed so far. So that's one of the projects. And then the other project, finally, is to do a documentary history on the development of Black theology in Britain and looking at its roots, as I said, in the empire, in the Caribbean and Africa, and in Asia, but also looking at some of the limitations and some of the shortfalls that have always been there. So, for example, in terms of Black women engaging in theology, there was not a Black woman in a tenured theological position in a university until 2024. So last year, a woman called Selena Stone, a Pentecostal woman, is the first Black woman to get a tenured position within a university. Within theological education, or within seminaries, one can still count on one hand the number of Black women and Asian women who have teaching positions within various institutions that are sponsored by our churches. It's still overwhelmingly white. And so part of that work is a follow-on from the book around deconstructing whiteness, to say, okay, so we've done that in terms of text and in terms of theological method and in terms of epistemology. Now, what does that look like in practice? What does it look like in terms of syllabi? What does that look like in terms of hiring practices? What does that look like in terms of who gets recognized and who gets appointed? And also in terms of when people offer for ministry, what type of pathways are they pushed into? So for the most part, Black and Asian people, when they offer for ministry in the church, it's very rarely the case that our different denominations will encourage them to become scholars, that will encourage them to do doctorates and to seek to go into the academy. They are always pushed into pastoral ministry. And it's not that there's anything wrong with pastoral ministry, but whereas white people, particularly white men, are given the opportunity to have a whole vast array of opportunities put before them, for Black and Asian people, particularly the women, they are rarely encouraged to go down the scholarly route.
Thank you very much for your leadership in all these projects. The decolonization of theology and theological education as well as pedagogy is so much needed. I can't wait to read your new book, Living Black Theology, which is going to come out in the first week or so in August. And thank you again, Anthony, for joining the podcast. Please support the podcast Quack and Roll by clicking comment and subscribe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Privilege.